Hello fellow commanders and field marshals, and welcome to another cards video with me, Bubblebox. And today it's my follow-up video from the alpha tournament video I did yesterday, and today I'm going to have a look at the two decks that I used in that tournament. You had to have a minimum of two decks, and I went for the ones I was more familiar with: the British, the Americans and Germany, in support for both nations, or as an ally for both nations. And I'll give my kind of reasons. This video might be useful more for beginners than experienced players, but I thought these were two pretty nice all-round decks which could deal with most other decks that were thrown at me, and it kind of turns out like that. I'm sure there's better decks out there, but this is the best I could do at the time of making this video. Now, the first thing to mention is, if we look at the top right, you can have a look at your kind of spread of points for your cards, and you can see for my British deck, and I think it's the same pretty much for my American deck as well, that most of my points were around the 2, 3, 4 mark, with a good splattering of 1 cards and just a few at the higher end, because I find that the way the game works at the moment is nearly all my games, or pretty much all my games, tend to end in mid-game. It doesn't matter if I win or lose, they all tend to win in tend to be over around the mid-game. Don't tend to get too many, or don't get any, going to the late game really, and a few do end early if I get up against rush decks and I have a bit of bad luck with my first couple of turns of the cards. Then with these decks that I'm using today, you can get rushed a little bit at the start, but on the whole they're pretty good all-round decks. I'm going to go through them with you now. We're starting with the British deck, and in fact what we're going to do, we're going to start with the order cards, because with the German allies I picked all order cards for the Germans. The reason for that is they've got some really nice cards whereby you can deal with anything the enemy puts into their support line rather. So if we go through the order cards first, I've got a British Monty, pin all enemy ground units and deal 1 damage, draw a card. This is pretty good because it only costs 1 point, and it can be used pretty much at any time in the game. You can kind of hold on to it and use it later in the game to pin many units, or if you want to get a good start and you draw this card early, you could use it early to try and get a good start as well, and you draw an extra card to hold. It is an elite, so you do have to have got that card, of course. The next one is actually the Atlantic Convoy. Deploy a random US unit that costs 3k or less and draw another one. And I'm lucky enough to have 2 of these, and they're both in my British German deck. Why is this useful? Well, it only costs 2 points. Now, if you get lucky, you don't have to be too lucky because you've got 2 of them in a deck of 40, but if you manage to draw this on your first, second or third turn, you do have the possibility to turn over and have a 3-point card played in your on the board right at the start of the game, which is extremely useful. And you may even draw another 3-point card into your hand, but then you do also have that extra card in your hand as well when you play this card. Next is Sky Barrens for the Germans. I like this because, well, they're removal cards, aren't they? I've got 3 of them, 3 Sky Barrens. Send a unit back to its owner's hand, and if it's a bomber, destroy it. So I try to hold on to these to destroy bombers. I haven't got any bombers at all in these 2 decks, but I do have the ability to destroy enemy bombers. I've also got quite a lot of fighters in these 2 decks as well, so I'm kind of okay against bombers for the most part. You can also use this to remove an enemy card and put it back into their hand, and I try not to do that because it still means they keep that card and can just produce it again. But if they've buffed up a card, and you can throw it back into their hand, quite useful card. I've also got MI5. Basically just does what it says on the tin. Your enemy discards a card, you draw a card. Don't really want this near the start, but useful kind of mid-game and later as well, when the enemy hasn't got so many cards in their hand. It can really spoil their tactics even if they're a good player. Then I've got to blockade, deal 1 damage to any target and your enemy destroys a random card. Again, that's really to upset the enemy's hand more than to aid your gameplay. Next, we've got Tactical Strike. I've got all 3 of the Tactical Strike cards for the Germans for both my US and British decks. Deal 2 damage to a unit, 4 damage if it's in the support line, and that's any unit. It doesn't matter if it's an air unit, tank or armoured unit, any unit, and even those pesky artillery that appear in the support line, you can do 4 damage to them. And with 3 cards, you're often going to have this held in your hand for use. Eagle Claws, kind of like a downgraded tactical strike, costs 3 points but does 2 damage to all the units in the support line. Really useful if you get 1 or 2 of these early on in the game and the enemy is bringing out lower point cards with less defense. Then you can use these. Sometimes you can have 2 of these in your hand and you can do like a 4 damage to the support line as well, to get rid of again some of those higher tier artillery units that might appear in the support line of the enemy. I've got 1 Empire Strikes. Only got 1, so it's a bit of a lottery as to when it comes up in your deck, but it does mean you do have the ability in your hand to destroy an enemy on the front line if there's one that's being really irritating. And then finally, this was my most debatable card to get. It's the Annihilation card for Germany. I only really put it in because I've just recently got it from a card pack and I wanted to try it out, but the downside is it costs 7 points, which is a lot to just destroy 1 enemy unit. So, but yeah, I put it in anyway. It's a bit iffy just in case you might draw this one near the start of the game and it kind of blocks your hand for a few times, but if you get it later on in the game it can be very, very useful. So that's all of the order cards for the Brits, and that's all the order cards. That's all the cards for the Germans. So all the rest of the cards in this deck are going to be British, and we're going to start off with my infantry. Now initially when I started playing the game, I started playing with the commandos because they're fun to play. With the commandos, which I haven't got in this deck, but I'll just mention them because they are an unusual card. You can do 1 damage to a random enemy every time you give an order. So if you've got a lot of order cards, and I've got about half order cards in this deck and about half ground units, then you can, do a damage every time you play one. But I find when you come up against good players, they know how to deal with these commandos, and they've got removal cards, and they pretty much target them and get rid of them really, really quickly. So you do have to have all 3, so you can bring another one out if you're up against a good player and they get rid of them early. And you kind of have to base your deck around protecting your commandos. So maybe not as useful as I initially thought. So I decided not to go with commandos. I decided to go with a more kind of all-round kind of blocking kind of deck and a long-term kind of deck, and it's a bit aggressive as well, as you'll see, because we've got Matildas and stuff as well coming up. But first of all, I've got the Royal Engineers, a good little buff card, give friendly units +2 defense. You want to get as many friendly units as you can on the field before you play this, so it can, if you get it really early on, it can be a bit of a pain. You want to get it kind of later on in a mid-game. So you've got a few units on the field to be able to use this with, and it's all friendly units as well, not just British, which is pretty good for just 2 points. Then I've got the basic guard unit. I went for the basic infantry guard unit rather than taking the tank guard because it's cheaper and you can still got 5 defense. So it's a nice cheap guard card. If you get one early in your deck, can be very useful if the enemy is playing a rush deck as well. Then we've got the Guards Brigade. Recently got this card, so I thought I'd put it in the deck. I think it's one of the more recently added cards to the alpha. 2 and 4 defense, and it's a guard card, and it gives adjacent ground units +1/+1. Now I haven't found this too useful because sometimes you only have 1 unit in a decent position to guard and give +1/+1, and when you bring out a guard card, also you normally want to guard your base as well. Or your headquarters, so that's kind of on one flank of this unit, and the other flank is going to have a ground unit, and sometimes you have planes out and stuff, so you can't always, because it's only ground units. So it's a situational kind of card, maybe not as useful as I was hoping it was going to be, and it's quite expensive at 4 points, but I've put it in anyway. It's an extra guard that gives me 4 guard cards in this deck, and it's very useful to have a few guard cards in your decks, especially if you're not a brilliant player, so you can just defend a little bit and have a think about what you're going to be doing next. No artillery units for the Brits. Could have had the 25-pounder, but I decided against that looking at the overall deck. I've got the Oh, sorry, I haven't got all command cards for the Germans. I have got a pack 36 as well. And that's got a recent addition to the game, and I managed to pick this card up. It is an elite, and with this card, when your enemy deploys an army unit, deal 1 damage to it. Very, very useful if you can get this one out early in the game. It's an ambush. The ambush bit of it isn't that useful because it's only 1 attack anyway, but a useful card for dampening down any heavy armored decks that you might come up against. I decided not to go for any of the flak. I have got any of the anti-air. I've got some nice anti-air actually, including the 88mm German flak, which, yeah, maybe I should have put in. It is a really useful card. It's 6 points though, quite expensive. Even the British anti-air guns are quite useful because they pin enemy air units when you bring them in. But I decided against, because of the balance that I wanted with this particular deck. It didn't really favour these. I went much more for fighters with this British deck. Moving on, no tank destroyers. Moving on to the tanks. Well, Humbers. This is really because I wanted something at the beginning of the game so that I can harass the enemy with. It's got Fury, so it can fire twice. I've got 3 of them. It's only 1 point. It's got 3 defense, so it's a little bit survivable in the early game. So hopefully, if you're lucky, you'll get 1 or 2 of these early on in the game, harass the enemy, and slow down any rush decks that the enemy might have as well. And if they've gone for a more mid-game, late-game deck, then you can really harass them with these Humbers as well, and force them even to use some of their nice removal cards early on in the game. Then I've gone for 4 Matildas. Now Matildas are really irritating cards to play against, so if you want to irritate your opposition, get Matildas, because every time they attack or every time something attacks them, they will pin the enemy, and also they are armored as well, so they're kind of difficult to get rid of. Basically, they're a really good defensive tank, and if you manage to buff them up, for example, if you have them with the Americans, they can even get 5 attack and stuff, so it can be good on the attack as well. Then I've gone for one of my very few expensive units, the A34 Comment, heavy armor, and it can have blitz if it's on the front game, so really good to play this to try in the mid game to try and win the game. Bring this out, push it into that front line, and try to do some damage really quickly with it before the enemy is able to take it out. That is an elite card though. Moving on to the interesting bombers, which I don't have any of. I decided not to go for bombers with these 2 decks. We'll have a look at bombers in another video later. But fighters, I've gone pretty heavy on the fighters. I've gone for the nice little Kitty Hawk. Quite nice if you can get it fairly early in the game. Deals 2 damage to an enemy ground unit when you deploy this unit. And decent little fighter for not too expensive a price. A bit more defensive, which is good for fighters. You want them to be able to defend your support line. Then I've gone for, I think everybody gets Hurricanes. It's a no-brainer. I prefer the Blitz Hurricane over the Fury Hurricane. The Fury Hurricane's more, and the enemy knows it's there for a turn before you're able to use it, because you have to bring it out. But with the Blitz, you can bring it out, use it on the same turn for 4 points. You can surprise the enemy. You've got 4 chances to do that as well. Really, this is just a must, I think, for any British deck, to have a number of these Blitz Hurricanes in the deck, whatever deck you use. Then we've got a couple of Spitfires, really good because they've got strong attack, strong defense, and they're just, again, really irritating to play against if you bring, because it often takes 2 cards to take these down. So that's 2 cards for 1 really. They're a little bit expensive, mid-game kind of fighter, but very useful. I decided just to go for 2, not go too mad on these because they are quite expensive, and I'd rather have those Hurricanes, which are cheaper and quicker to use. Then probably one of the best British cards you can have is the Mosquito. You only get 1 of them. It's an elite card, but oh so useful. 5 defense, 4 on the attack, but also gives you that 3 damage to an enemy unit on deployment, so you can kind of surprise the enemy, and you'll have a fighter on the field, a good fighter on the field at the same time, all for just 5 points, whereas the enemy whereas the Spitfire also costs 5, but I just think the Mosquito is even better than the Spitfire, to be honest. And that's pretty much it. That's the British deck. So we've got infantry. I'll just quickly mention in the tank section, a lot of people go for the Churchill heavy armor. It is good. It does cost 2 points to use, so early on in the game it's difficult to use because it costs 2 points to use after you've brought it out. But apart from that, that's kind of all I want to mention really. So that's my British deck. So we're going to move on now and have a look at my American German where are we? My American German deck, my USA Germany deck, which I also used in the tournament. Now I'm not going to go through the German units because they're all exactly the same as my British deck, but what we've got in the Germany, we'll go with the order cards first again. I've got 4 supply shipments, which gives you 4 defense and guard. I was debating whether to get 4 of these, but I decided to in the end because they're quite useful on the defense. I maybe should have swapped these out for some more offensive cards or some more ground units and maybe had just 2 of these perhaps in retrospect, because this kind of spoilt my 3rd game against Proto Soccer because I just had command cards and didn't have anything to play. So yeah, so there's that. But also, if you're playing decks that don't have a lot of guard cards, these can be really useful in giving you that guard unit for only 2 points. So there's Germans, the same as the British deck. Then I've gone for, of course, got the buff cards for the Germans, got the 2 for freedom cards, give a ground unit +2/+2, and you draw a card as well. Very powerful unit, that one. And then I've taken the mobilization. This didn't even come out for me in both my or in all 3 of my games. So you have to be a bit lucky to get this early on. It does cost 5 anyway, so you don't really want it really early on because it kind of blocks your hand. But it's a draw 3 card, so very helpful mid-game. And then that's the Annihilation for the Germans, as before. Moving on then, we'll have a look at the infantry. I've gone for just 3 infantry. The Americans have got some interesting infantry. I've taken 3 506th Airborne, really because they are only 1 point and they're a 2/2. So really good early game card again. Rush the enemy a little bit perhaps, or defend against a rush. Really useful to have early in the game. Those 506th Airborne units. And then I've gone for the 30th Regiment. It isn't elite, but it's a 4/4 card. Again, doesn't really do anything too special, but it's a 4/4 card for 3 points. Again, very useful. And then I've got 101st Airborne, a bit expensive at 5, but it has got ambush and blitz. So with a 4 attack, that ambush is pretty damn good, and the enemy often resorts to using a removal card to get rid of this if you play it in the game, and gets rid of one of their removal cards from their hand. Also, you get to deal 2 damage to a target in the enemy support line when you deploy this, and it's blitz as well, so you can bring it in and move it straight onto the front line and deal 2 damage to the enemy. So if you've got 5, what does that cost? 6 points. If you've got 6 points spare, you can do that with the airborne unit here. Really nice. There's some other interesting ones. What else have we got down here which I didn't use? Yeah, the 7th Regiment are quite good as well. Draw a card when the 7th Regiment used to the front line if you're playing a fairly aggressive deck. But I played these. I think that was okay for this particular deck. Artillery, not gone for anyone. They've got the nice pack howitzers that a lot of people use, but I decided against that. And of course, I didn't go for any of the German ones. The 10.5 centimeter field guns really nice as well, but I just wanted to keep my Germans mainly for the support section. But I have got that. Did I go for the? Oh yeah, I went for the pack 36, just as I did for the British deck. Moving on to the tank destroyers, I did get Wolverine. I was debating about getting this or getting another tank, but I went for the Wolverine, you know, just in case you come up against Germans or something. And it is useful because on deployment you get to deal 2 damage to a random enemy armoured unit, and it's only 3 points and deals double damage to armoured units. So again, a little bit situational, but most people play a lot of tanks, so it's going to be useful whatever decks you come up against probably. Perhaps maybe not so much the Russians and the Japanese, but certainly good against the Brits and against other American and German decks, the Wolverines and other anti-tank weapons. Then we've got the tanks. Went heavy on the Shermans and got the M8 Greyhounds. Again, the M8 Greyhounds a little bit like the British deck. I've gone for something that I can bring out early in the game, hopefully, if I draw it. Only costs 1 point, and it's blitz, so you can harass the enemy or hold them back if they've got a rush deck. Really useful, the M8 Greyhound, and it also has the ability, if it's on the front line, to give an extra point to your support line units as well. And then I've gone for 4 Shermans. So this is the one of the mainstays of this deck. My 4 Shermans. You get to draw a card when you play this, which is very useful. Unfortunately, it doesn't have blitz, which would make it completely OP probably. But on deployment, draw a card, but you do have to wait a turn until you actually can use this, so the enemy will know it's there and have the opportunity to take it out or take it down on a few points before you get to use it, which is a little bit of a drawback with the M4 Sherman. There are a number of other nice tanks, but they were mainly the German ones, so got the Panther G, which I decided against. I might try a German deck at some point. I think this is when, yeah, I mean, I've got the Tiger as well. But just decided to go for those 2 armoured vehicles. Again, bombers. I did take a couple with the Americans, unlike the Brits, where I didn't take any bombers. Took the Dauntless because it's only 3 points and can, again, be a little bit irritating for the enemy if you manage to bring out a 3-point bomber early on the game under smoke, which might force them again to use an early removal card. It's also got heavy armour, so can survive a little bit of punishment from fighters. Yeah, so a nice little bomber for early-ish game. And then we've got the TBF-1 Avenger. I've just recently got this again. And on deployment, will destroy a random enemy unit with 6 or more defense. So kind of, you want to try to hold this card back until a late game if you can, with the enemies bringing out its more powerful units. It is useful as a kind of bomber in its own right, but it is 6 points for a 4/4 bomber. But really, you want to try and hold it in your hand as long as you can, and hopefully you want to be getting this later on in the game. Fighters at game, we've gone reasonably heavy on the fighters for the Americans. I am lacking a little bit in anti-air in this deck, but I like these lightnings, especially if you get one of these early on in the game. And I was tempted to get 3 of these and just 2 Corsairs, but I got 2 in the... oh, I can't get 3, can I? Oh, I can get 3 if I wanted. Yeah, I was tempted to get 3 because they're really useful early on. If the enemy hasn't deployed a fighter yet or an airborne unit yet, you can put one of these out and send one of their units back into their hand just for deploying it. And then you get a nice fighter on the field as well with 5 defense. Then we've got the Corsair F4U. A really nice all-round fighter, basically with 4 attack and 6 defense, so takes a bit of getting off the field once you get one of these onto your play field. And that's pretty much it, guys. That is my American deck. So that's the American German deck and also the British German deck. And we have a quick look up here. The spread for my American deck is very similar to my British deck. They both play in a similar way, and basically for this tournament I just had limited time to prepare for it, so I thought I would just do 2 similar decks that do all-round decks that could do a little bit of everything and fight off most enemy decks, and it did pretty okay for me in the tournament this time round. I will of course change it up for next time. So that's it. Let me know what you think about this in the comments below, what you think I should change. Of course, this is a rapidly evolving game, so if you watch this video in a few weeks' time, it's probably going to be a completely defunct deck. But anyway, thank you all very much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, please bung me a like and subscribe if you want to see more. And I'll see you in the next one.